Have you ever thought about what happens when the bonds of family are tested, not just by time, but by desperation, misunderstanding, and even betrayal? This is a story about a woman named Eleanor, a grandmother in her twilight years, who finds herself abandoned and betrayed by the very children she raised with love and sacrifice. As Eleanor struggles to maintain her dignity and secure her home, she is forced to confront the harsh realities of aging, familial responsibility, and the changing dynamics of the family unit. In a world that often prioritizes success, independence, and self-reliance, Eleanor's heart-wrenching journey raises deep questions about what it means to be family. What is the true role of children in their parents' later years? What does it mean to care for one another when the expectations of society push us further apart? Eleanor's story is a reminder that as we age, the relationships we've spent our lives building are tested in ways we can't always predict. The values of respect, responsibility, and loyalty are challenged when the world around us becomes more complicated, and we often face difficult choices about how to honor both our own needs and those of the people who once cared for us. Before we dive deeper into Eleanor's journey, I encourage you to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means so much to me, and if you find this video meaningful, you can help spread these important lessons by liking and sharing them with others. And now, if you like the theme of today's video, please comment 1 to show your support. If you don't, comment 0 to let me know how I can improve and make future videos more engaging for you. Let's begin. First, speak less. It may sound counterintuitive, but the more parents talk, the easier it becomes to lose their authority. Let me share an insightful story from an education expert that highlights this point perfectly. A close friend of this expert had a son who was about to go on a school spring trip. It was his first time being away from home for such an extended period, and of course, his grandmother, deeply concerned for his safety, wanted to make sure he didn't forget anything important. She spent the entire morning reminding him about all sorts of things: what to pack, what to watch out for, and of course, to be careful. At first, the boy listened politely, offering short replies. But after about half an hour of this, the boy, clearly growing frustrated, blurted out, "Grandma, you've said enough. It's too much." Watching this scene, the education expert's friend felt a wave of sadness for the grandmother, who stood there, clearly hurt and confused by the boy's response. Her heart was in the right place. She only wanted what was best for him. But the way she kept repeating herself made the boy, understandably, feel overwhelmed. The situation took a turn when the expert pointed out something that many parents overlook: the more you talk, the less authority you have. As it turns out, constant reminders and excessive talking from parents can backfire. What starts as an attempt to protect or guide often ends up causing frustration in children, who begin to tune out and lose respect. A blogger on social media once shared a similar complaint about her upbringing. She grew up with a mother who was constantly nagging about everything. No matter how many times she said something, her mother would repeat it. Whether it was a small reminder like asking her to bring her books to school or something more important, like choosing a college major. While the blogger knew her mother meant well, every time she spoke, she felt suffocated by the constant stream of advice. This didn't make her feel loved. It made her feel controlled. The difference between the mother's and father's approach was clear. The father, though equally concerned, took a different route. One time, as his son was about to leave for a trip, the son asked, "Dad, do you have any advice for me?" The father, ever so brief, simply said, "Be careful. And don't spend all day glued to your phone." When the son later studied abroad, every time they spoke, his father's words were no longer than a couple of sentences. But those few words always carried weight. The son never remembered his father scolding him, but he remembered every word his father had said, taking them to heart. The truth here is that, as the well-known Professor Lai Mikan once pointed out, speaking too much will lose authority. The more parents talk, the less impact their words have. When parents lecture endlessly, they diminish their authority, and without that authority, respect can easily fade. So, if you ever find yourself wondering why your children don't seem to respect you or listen to your advice, consider this. It might not be because they don't care about what you have to say. It could be because you've said too much. The key is to control your own words. Instead of constantly preaching, focus on setting an example through your actions. When your behavior is consistent and admirable, your children will naturally respect and listen to you. But there's another important aspect here. Treat your children as equals. Give them the space to express themselves and listen to their thoughts. Acknowledge their mistakes with kindness and understanding. When they feel respected as individuals, they'll return that respect, and their love for you will grow stronger. Second, establish authority. The weaker the parents, the more likely it is that the children will take over. This truth hit me hard when I recently came across a heartbreaking news story. A mother enrolled her young daughter in extra classes to help improve her poor academic performance. But the daughter, uninterested in the lessons, stubbornly refused to go. No matter how much the mother tried to explain or advise, her words fell on deaf ears. Desperate, the mother resorted to begging her daughter, even kneeling in the middle of the street to plead with her to attend the classes. But instead of feeling moved, the daughter grew more enraged. She shouted at her mother, "If you want to kneel here, I don't care," and stormed off. Watching the mother chase after her child, helpless and desperate, left me feeling both sad and disturbed. The writer Truong Ai Lin once said, "Loving someone means lowering oneself into the dust." This quote, though it may sound romantic in some contexts, is tragically fitting when describing situations like this one. The weaker the parents, the easier it becomes for children to lose all respect for them. In this case, the mother's extreme behavior didn't earn her any respect from her daughter. Instead, it led to a complete breakdown in authority and roles within the family. The daughter did not understand that, as a parent, it was the mother's responsibility to guide and set boundaries. The child's behavior wasn't just a sign of disrespect, it was a sign of role reversal. The child had taken control, and the mother had become the one begging for compliance. Parents must recognize that their role is to guide, not to give in to every demand or lose themselves in the process of trying to be loved by their children. If parents continually lower their authority and act as if they are subordinate to their children, they cannot be surprised when the child takes over. Without respect for parental authority, children may begin to see their parents not as caregivers, but as free servants, there to serve their whims and desires. There's an old saying that goes, "Parents who kneel cannot raise strong children." This saying captures the essence of parental responsibility. To gain respect from your children, you must first establish your authority. It's not about being harsh, but about showing consistency, leadership, and unwavering guidance. If your children see that you are unwilling to stand firm, they will not learn the lessons that will help them grow into respectful and responsible adults. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. When discipline is needed, it must be enforced, especially when children display unacceptable behaviors, such as poor manners, disrespect for others, or refusal to follow rules. Take, for example, a situation shared by a parent on social media. His daughter, a typical teenager, thought she could get whatever she wanted, and her behavior toward the family had become rude and self-centered. One evening, when she was watching TV and refused to come to the table for dinner, her father didn't wait. He didn't hold up the meal or beg her to come. He simply sat down and ate with the rest of the family. When his daughter finally wandered into the dining room, expecting her plate to be waiting, she was shocked to see that her food had been given to someone else. She immediately burst into tears, demanding an explanation. The father, calm but firm, took his daughter into another room to talk. He didn't raise his voice, but he delivered 3 important lessons that would change the course of their relationship. First, parents love you very much, but that doesn't mean we will always prioritize you over others. Everyone in this house has responsibilities, and we all share in the effort to make it work. Second, you need to understand that others care for you, and you should be grateful for that. Respect and appreciation for others' efforts are vital. Third, when you ask for something, you must be polite and say please. After that conversation, the daughter did something that surprised everyone. She apologized to the family for her behavior. And from that moment forward, her attitude began to change. She stopped acting as if the world revolved around her and became much more respectful and considerate. Her behavior towards her parents, and adults in general, improved significantly. This story illustrates an important point. Loving your children is instinctual for most parents, but establishing authority is a long-term investment in their future. It's not always easy, but it's necessary. As parents, we must be the ones to set clear boundaries and principles that will guide our children's actions. Children learn respect not only through words but through the consistency of our actions and the boundaries we set for them. When parents take the time to set appropriate limits, children learn what is acceptable and what is not. This structure helps foster an environment where mutual respect flourishes, creating harmony and understanding within the family. Third, let go. The more parents do, the more children do not know when to stop. The more parents do for their children, the more their children fail to recognize when to stop. This can lead to a sense of entitlement that makes it difficult for children to appreciate the hard work and sacrifices made by their parents. In her book Dare to Love, Dare to Let Go, author Shefali Saboui offers a powerful insight. Parents shouldn't love their children excessively, they should love them appropriately. Many parents fall into the trap of doing everything for their children, often before the children even ask. This overdoing can inadvertently create a dynamic where children begin to expect everything, taking for granted that their parents will fulfill all their desires. The result? Ungrateful and entitled children who never learn to appreciate the true value of hard work or responsibility. Take, for example, a story that made headlines a few years ago. It involved a 23-year-old American girl studying abroad in Spain. She was a college dropout who was living off money sent by her father, who worked hard to provide for her. This father earned a modest income of $1,000 per month, but regularly sent his daughter $850 to cover her living expenses. Despite this generous support, the daughter lived irresponsibly, spending money on luxury items and living a lavish lifestyle. She used credit cards to continue her spending spree even after her allowance was depleted. When her father found out and gently advised her to be more careful with her spending, his daughter responded with public scorn. She shared their private conversation on social media, insulted him in front of her followers, and called on people to throw stones at him. Her harsh words included, "If you can't support me, don't have me." In essence, this young woman had no concept of financial responsibility or appreciation for the sacrifices her father made to support her. Instead, she felt entitled to his money and dismissed his concerns as unnecessary. This story highlights the core of the message. Letting go means giving children the space to become independent, make their own decisions, and learn from the consequences of those decisions. It doesn't mean stopping the love. Rather, it's about allowing children to take responsibility for their lives and learn the value of hard work, sacrifice, and gratitude. When parents overindulge their children, fulfilling every whim and even anticipating needs before the children have voiced them, it creates an unhealthy dependency. In this case, the girl was 23 years old, an adult by many standards. But instead of becoming independent, she remained entirely reliant on her father, even using his financial support as an excuse to live recklessly. When her father tried to instill responsibility in her, she didn't understand his perspective at all. Instead, she blamed him for not giving her enough. This type of behavior can be seen in many families, and it underscores a deeper issue. In The Art of Positive Parenting, the authors write, "Parents doing too much for their children will deprive them of the opportunity to develop their abilities and will foster a habit of dependence. Children begin to believe that it is natural to be served by their parents. And what follows is a lack of respect. When children grow up with the idea that their parents exist solely to serve them, they fail to see the true cost behind every sacrifice their parents make. The key to breaking this cycle is for parents to understand that they must let go. This means relinquishing control over every detail of their children's lives, even if it feels uncomfortable. Letting go doesn't mean stopping love. It means allowing children to step into their shoes and take on responsibility. Letting go doesn't just benefit the child. It also strengthens the parent-child relationship. When parents allow their children to navigate life on their own terms, children begin to understand the challenges their parents face and develop a deeper sense of gratitude. They begin to see that their comfortable lives are not just gifts. They are the result of hard work, sacrifice, and love. Consider the wisdom in letting children experience life's ups and downs for themselves. This doesn't mean abandoning them, but rather stepping back to give them the space to grow, learn, and mature. It is through these challenges that children will ultimately learn the true value of responsibility and respect. Parents must recognize that overcompensating for their children's mistakes or trying to smooth out every bump in their lives only serves to deprive them of valuable lessons. The more parents intervene, the less their children learn about real life. By letting go, parents not only teach independence but also instill a sense of humility and gratitude, values that will serve their children well in adulthood. For example, take my Aunt Linda's experience with her daughter, Emily. When Emily was in middle school, she threw a major tantrum because she didn't get the latest iPhone. In a fit of frustration, she called her mother cheap, as if the world owed her everything. That moment was a wake-up call for Aunt Linda. She realized she had been indulging Emily far too much and had failed to set appropriate boundaries. That evening, she made a tough but necessary decision. She returned the phone and told Emily that she would need to earn the money for the next one herself, either through doing chores at home or by saving her own pocket money. Moreover, Aunt Linda reduced Emily's pocket money, explaining that if she spent it all and didn't have enough left, it was her responsibility to figure out how to make up the difference. Gone were the days of Aunt Linda doing everything for Emily. No more would she clean her room, wash her clothes, or even hover over her every little move. In the beginning, Emily fought against these changes. She resisted, argued, and complained about the new rules. But, over time, as Aunt Linda truly let go and stopped giving in to her daughter's demands, Emily began to adjust. She had no choice but to become more self-sufficient. One pivotal moment came during a summer vacation when Emily worked at a street vendor's booth. The job was grueling, long hours in the sweltering heat for a modest paycheck. That experience opened her eyes to the harsh realities of working for a living. For the first time, she understood just how much effort went into earning money. Emily began to realize the sacrifices her parents made to provide for her and her siblings, and she gradually stopped wasting money on frivolous things. She learned the value of hard work, responsibility, and financial independence. This story illustrates a key point. A good education is not about giving children everything they want or providing them with a life of ease and comfort. It's about preparing them for the realities of the world, teaching them resilience, and helping them mature through experience. As children grow, they need to witness their parents' sacrifices and understand the challenges that come with earning a living. Only then will they appreciate the value of what they have and begin to respect and obey their parents. American family psychologist Dr. Jane Nelson once said, "Children making mistakes is not scary. What is scary is parents, the guides for their children, lacking proper educational knowledge and appropriate parenting methods." This quote rings true because often parents, out of love and concern, end up doing too much for their children. They talk too much, take on too much responsibility, and, in doing so, unintentionally diminish their children's respect and sense of responsibility. In contrast, the key to effective parenting is balance. Methodical teaching with loving moderation, tolerance, and limits. This approach enables children to learn responsibility, respect, and gratitude. Loving your children is instinctual, but it's how you love them that truly matters. By guiding them with wisdom and teaching them with intention, children learn to appreciate their parents' efforts and understand the importance of self-sufficiency. In many cases, we, as parents, might feel compelled to protect our children from the difficulties of life. However, by doing so, we often rob them of the opportunity to learn valuable lessons. Instead of being their protectors, we should aim to be their companions, helping them navigate life's challenges, teaching them independence, and showing them how to take responsibility for their actions. The principles of speak less, establish authority, and let go are simple, yet they form the foundation of a strong, respectful parent-child relationship. Harmony between parents and children doesn't come from love alone. It also requires wise and thoughtful parenting. As parents, we should take a moment to reassess our methods, allowing our children the space to learn, grow, and develop respect for us. By offering methodical teaching and loving with moderation, we give our children the greatest gift of all: the ability to understand, appreciate, and be grateful for the world around them. Loneliness in old age. When children casually regret only when it's too late. It's often assumed that having children is a guarantee of being cared for in old age. Many cultures hold the belief that children owe their parents gratitude and should be there to support them as they grow older. However, in today's world, an unsettling number of parents find themselves living alone in their later years. Not because they don't have children, but because their grown children forget the very foundation of family bonds. It's a painful reality that many elderly parents face today. Take the story of Joan Carter, a mother who devoted her entire life to raising her 4 children. Now, in her golden years, Joan had hoped that her children would reciprocate that love and care. But as time passed and her health began to decline, Joan found herself abandoned by the very people she had raised with so much sacrifice. Her children, successful and busy with their own families, had moved on with their lives, leaving Joan to fend for herself. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Joan had always believed that having 4 children meant she would be surrounded by support in her old age. However, as she grew older and more fragile, it became painfully clear that this was not the case. Her children, despite their successes, Matthew, the eldest, now a well-respected engineer, Sarah, a nurse, David, a lawyer, and Brian, an entrepreneur, had all but forgotten about her. They rarely visited, and when they did, it was often for convenience, helping with their children or asking for money. Heartbroken and disillusioned, Joan tried to reach out, but her children's responses were dismissive, and at times, outright disrespectful. If you think you're so entitled to our help, why don't you take us to court and see how the world reacts? They mocked, their voices dripping with disdain. Joan's heart ached as she recalled the early days of raising them. She had always believed that the love and care she had given them would ensure they would one day return that same care when she needed it. But as she watched them live their lives without so much as a glance back, the bitter truth sank in. Her children had moved on, and not only had they forgotten her sacrifices, but they had also grown indifferent to her needs. Joan's story echoes a familiar narrative in many households. When she and her late husband, Tom, had their children, they thought they were doing the right thing, raising a large family, providing for them, and giving them the opportunities they never had. When the children were young, they were full of love and admiration. But as the years passed, and the children grew older, their priorities shifted. The relationships that once seemed so strong withered, replaced by selfishness and the pursuit of their dreams. Joan's family was once the envy of her neighborhood. 4 children, each well-educated and with promising careers. In the early years, Joan and Tom felt blessed to have such a large family, believing that having many children would guarantee that they would never be alone in their old age. But as her children grew more successful, their visits became less frequent, and their conversations shorter. When Joan became ill, it was not her children who came running to help, but a kind neighbor who would check in on her from time to time. This story of Joan Carter is not unique. It's a growing issue faced by many parents in today's society, where the connection between generations is often strained by busy schedules, personal ambitions, and the demands of modern life. Many elderly parents are left wondering where they went wrong, questioning whether their children truly understand the sacrifices they made. Joan, like many others, was left with nothing but her memories of the days when her children were young and full of love, before the harsh reality of old age set in. Joan Carter's life had taken an unexpected turn after the death of her husband, Tom. Together, they had lived a simple but comfortable life in their retirement years, with Tom's pension being their primary source of income. The pension, which was $300 a month, had been enough to cover their modest living expenses. But after Tom's sudden death, Joan found herself struggling to make ends meet. Her husband had always handled the finances, and now, with only half of their previous pension income, $150 a month, Joan had to find a way to live on much less. The pension, though sufficient for basic food and living costs, barely covered the medical expenses Joan now faced. Her health began to deteriorate rapidly. What started as occasional aches and pains from aging turned into severe joint pain and heart issues. She had frequent medical checkups, but her limited income meant she could only afford traditional remedies, not the more expensive treatments her doctors recommended. The stress of losing her partner, combined with her declining health, weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't help but wonder where her children had gone, those same children she had raised with such love and care. At 65, Joan decided to take a step that she hoped would ease her burdens. She approached each of her 4 children, Matthew, Sarah, David, and Brian, and expressed her wish to live with them on a rotating basis. She thought that perhaps staying with each of them for a few months at a time would ease the financial strain and give her the companionship and care she desperately needed. She envisioned this arrangement as a solution where her children wouldn't need to worry about her, and she could use her pension to cover her medical expenses. Her children's reactions were cold, however. Matthew, the eldest and the wealthiest, pushed the responsibility onto his younger brothers, claiming that they lived closer and it would be more convenient for them to care for her. Sarah, who had a stable job as a nurse, said she couldn't possibly take her mother in because her grandchildren lived far away, and it would be too difficult to manage. David and Brian, the younger sons, quarreled over who should take her in, each one blaming the other. Joan was left with no choice but to continue pleading, hoping that anyone, would step forward and take responsibility for their aging mother. Her last hope was Sarah, who had once been close to Joan and had even lived with her for a few years while she helped care for her grandchildren. However, when Joan visited her daughter, Sarah flatly refused. "It's the responsibility of the sons," Sarah said coldly, "not mine." She made it clear that she had no intention of caring for her mother. Heartbroken, Joan realized that none of her children were willing to take on the responsibility of caring for her, and it crushed her spirit. Joan confided in an old friend who had always been a source of wisdom. Her friend advised her not to accommodate her children any longer. If they were unwilling to fulfill their obligations, Joan should not hesitate to demand that they contribute financially or help in some other way. Joan should take the matter to local authorities, her friend suggested, so that her children could be legally compelled to care for her. Joan hesitated, unsure whether she wanted to disgrace her family. Despite the deep pain she felt, she was not one to cause conflict. Instead, she decided to speak to each of her children individually, hoping that they would recognize their duty and understand how much she had done for them. But the response was the same: cold indifference. Matthew, her eldest son, was particularly dismissive. He told Joan, "It's not just my responsibility. If you want me to bear the burden, you should never have raised 4 kids. Don't put all this on me." The words stung, and Joan was left reeling from the cruelty of her son's response. She could not comprehend how a child she had raised with so much love and sacrifice could treat her with such disdain. "If you think you can treat me like this," she told Matthew, "I'll report you to the authorities." Matthew, irritated by her threats, fired back, "Go ahead, sue me. Let's see how the world reacts." His words were a harsh reminder of the reality Joan now faced, a reality where the children she had sacrificed so much for no longer cared for her at all. In the years before Tom's sudden death, Joan Carter had never once considered relying on her only son, Michael. Both she and her husband had worked hard, maintaining stable jobs and earning relatively good incomes. Even after they retired, Their pensions were more than enough for a comfortable life, without needing assistance from their son. Throughout Michael's life, Joan and her husband had always provided him with the best, educating him, helping him purchase his first home, and offering financial support whenever necessary. They had always hoped that their love and generosity would ensure his well-being, believing that they had raised him well and that he, in turn, would take care of them in their later years. But as time passed, Joan realized how quickly life can change. Her husband's unexpected death at 64 due to a sudden illness was a blow that rocked her world. Before he passed, Tom had left behind over $16,000 in savings, along with their modest home. They had agreed that this money would be reserved for Joan's comfort in old age. If not needed, it would eventually go to Michael. They had never thought about dividing the estate with him early on because their plan was simple. As long as they were both alive, they would manage on their own. They wanted Michael to be free from the burden of worrying about their finances. But suddenly, Joan was alone. She continued to live in the house that had been their home for so many years. Michael, now in his mid-30s with a wife and children, noticed that his mother was living alone, but he had no intention of offering to take her in. He assumed that, with the savings and the house, she would be fine on her own. Joan continued to live her life independently, not wanting to bother her son, but as the months wore on, it became clear that her health was declining. She had never expected to need Michael's support, but now, without her husband, the loneliness and the burden of aging were becoming harder to bear. When she reached out to Michael for help, he only begrudgingly agreed to let her stay with them. However, there were conditions. Michael and his wife, Amanda, laid out 4 strict rules that Joan had to follow if she wanted to live with them. First, she had to maintain personal hygiene, which they felt she had neglected over the years. Michael said she had developed bad habits and was like a country person who didn't know how to take care of herself. He demanded that she take daily showers, brush her teeth morning and night, and always change into clean clothes. He also instructed her not to spit or cough in public places, but to do so only in the bathroom or toilet. Joan was taken aback by the harshness of his words but agreed, not wanting to make waves. Second, she was not allowed to interfere in their private matters. Michael explained that Joan was the type of person who would always try to manage everything and offer her opinion, whether it was about family decisions or the way Amanda and he raised their children. He said Joan had no place in their arguments and that when it came to decisions about their children's education and future, she was to stay silent and follow whatever decisions they made. Amanda, he emphasized, was the female head of the household, and Joan was expected to defer to her. The conditions were difficult for Joan to accept. After all, she had spent years managing her household, making decisions about her family and children. To suddenly be told she could no longer have an opinion, that her experiences and wisdom counted for nothing, was humiliating. But as Joan sat in the living room, her mind replaying the memories of all the years she had spent nurturing Michael and supporting him and his family, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of injustice. She had always given without asking for anything in return. Now, in her time of need, her son and daughter-in-law had set these harsh terms for her, as if she were a stranger, not the mother who had cared for him all his life. Despite the hurt, Joan tried to comply with their demands. She showered regularly, brushed her teeth as instructed, and refrained from giving her opinion during family disagreements. But she couldn't shake the feeling of growing resentment. The home that had once been filled with love and care now felt cold and impersonal. Joan no longer felt like a beloved mother but a guest tolerated only because of the conditions she had agreed to. As the weeks went on, the atmosphere in the house became more strained. Joan began to realize just how much had changed. The child she had raised with love and sacrifice was now treating her like a burden. It was only when Michael and Amanda saw her cry one evening, when the weight of it all became too much for her to bear, that they finally softened. They began to reconsider their rules, but the damage had already been done. Joan couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake. Had she been too self-reliant for too long? Did she make her son believe that he didn't have to care for her, even when the time came. Joan Carter had never imagined a time when she would have to rely on her only son, Michael. In her earlier years, both she and her late husband had steady jobs with respectable incomes, allowing them to live comfortably without the need for financial help from anyone, especially their son. When they retired, their pensions were enough to cover their needs, and they continued to live independently. They had always supported Michael in every way possible, giving him the best education, helping him buy a house, and providing for his family without ever asking for anything in return. They wanted him to have the best life, free from any financial struggles. When Tom passed away suddenly at 64, Joan was left to navigate life without her partner. Although he had left behind savings of about $16,000 in their home, they had agreed that the money was intended for Joan's comfort in her old age. If it wasn't needed for her expenses, it would eventually go to Michael. Joan hadn't thought much about dividing the estate early on. After all, they had always been self-sufficient, and the plan was for her to live comfortably without relying on anyone. But with Tom gone, everything changed. Joan continued to live in the house, maintaining her independence as best as she could. But as time passed, she began to notice the toll that aging and loneliness were taking on her. Her health began to decline. She needed help, but when she reached out to Michael for support, she was met with indifference. It wasn't until her health worsened that Michael and his wife, Amanda, reluctantly agreed to let her move in with them, but only on certain terms. Michael laid out 4 conditions, which Joan felt were not just harsh but disrespectful to the years she had spent caring for him. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. First, Joan was told she must maintain strict personal hygiene. Michael criticized her for what he called country habits, a lack of cleanliness that, in his eyes, made her smell unpleasant. He told her that she would need to bathe daily, brush her teeth twice a day, and change her clothes regularly. Joan was shocked at the demand. She had never considered herself unkempt, but Michael insisted that she meet his standards. Second, Joan was told she could not interfere in family matters. Michael and Amanda had always valued their privacy, but now they wanted to control every aspect of Joan's involvement in the family. She was forbidden from offering her opinions on any family matters, whether it was about their children's education or the future of their household. Joan, who had spent years making decisions for her own family, was now being silenced in her own home. Amanda, as the female head of the household, was to be obeyed at all times. Third, Joan was required to hand over all her savings. Michael argued that the money Joan had saved over the years, money left by her late husband for her use, should now be handed over to him. He told her that it would be used for her medical expenses in the future, but Joan saw it as an attempt to take control of everything she had. She was told that if she gave them the savings, she would be safe and cared for, but what would she do if she needed money for herself? Michael insisted that it would be easier for her to ask for money from them, but Joan knew better. Asking for money from her son would be a last resort, one that no parent ever wanted to have to do. Finally, Michael demanded that Joan sell her house in the countryside. He argued that the house would eventually be theirs, and if she sold it now, it would be more beneficial for everyone, especially if her grandchildren needed a place near their high school. Joan was expected to sell the house, even though it was a symbol of independence, a place where she had lived with her husband for many years. The idea of selling it was unthinkable, but Michael was insistent. The rising property values, he argued, would make it a smart financial decision. Joan found herself in an impossible situation. While she could agree to some of the conditions, like maintaining hygiene, the third and fourth conditions were beyond her ability to accept. Her savings, which had been set aside for her old age, were now being demanded by her son. And selling the house, a space filled with memories of her life with Tom, seemed like a betrayal of everything they had worked for. Joan felt cornered. She had always taken care of Michael and had never expected anything in return. Now, when she needed help, she was being treated like a burden. Despite the promises that her savings would be safe with Michael and Amanda, Joan knew better. She refused to hand over everything. She agreed to give them a small amount of her pension for living expenses, but that was all. In the end, Joan made a decision that shocked everyone. She sold her house and used the money to move into a high-end nursing home. Her children were furious, especially when they realized that the proceeds from the sale and the compensation for her land could have been shared among them. They felt entitled to a portion of the money, but Joan had had enough. She had spent years sacrificing for them, and now it was her turn to live for herself. As Joan settled into her new life at the nursing home, she found a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. Her children, now regretting their actions, visited her in shifts, trying to make amends. They begged for her forgiveness, but Joan remained resolute. During holidays, they invited her to come home, but she refused, saying, "In the past, you treated me with such coldness, and now I will do the same. I will not return to the place where I was not welcome." Her children called her selfish and indifferent, but Joan knew that after years of living for others, it was time to live for herself. She had no regrets. She had endured enough, and now she was determined to enjoy her final years with dignity and peace, free from the expectations and judgments of her children. Joan Carter had never imagined she would find herself in such a position. After her husband's passing, she had hoped for peace and security in her later years, holding onto the house that was filled with memories of a lifetime together. But now, her son Michael and his wife Amanda, who had always seemed so appreciative of the sacrifices Joan and Tom had made for them, were asking for far more than she could give. Michael's demands were clear and unwavering. If Joan wanted to stay in their home, she had to comply with a list of conditions that felt not only unreasonable but disrespectful. First, Joan was told she had to adhere to their strict hygiene standards. Michael, with his blunt criticism, told her she was like someone from the countryside, with bad habits and poor personal hygiene. He insisted she take daily baths, change clothes frequently, and maintain impeccable cleanliness. Brushing her teeth twice a day, he said, was mandatory, along with putting away any spitting or phlegm in the bathroom or toilet. Joan had never considered herself unkempt, but hearing her son speak of her in such terms left her feeling degraded. She had cared for him his whole life, never once imposing her habits on him, but now she was being treated like a child with no sense of cleanliness. Second, Joan was told she could no longer involve herself in family matters. Michael, having grown accustomed to making decisions with Amanda, told Joan that she was too involved in their lives and needed to stop meddling. When the couple argued, she was not to take sides. When it came to their children's education and their future, she was to remain silent. Amanda was the female head of the household, he said, and Joan was expected to obey her daughter-in-law without question. Joan, who had always been a strong, opinionated woman, could not believe her son was asking her to keep quiet about things that mattered most to her. Third, Michael demanded that Joan hand over all her savings. The savings she had accumulated over the years, meant to provide for her later years, were no longer hers to keep. Michael argued that the money should be considered as part of her future medical expenses and that by entrusting it to them, she would be safe. Joan felt a pang of anxiety. If she gave them everything, what would she do if an emergency arose? She had friends, social obligations, and personal expenses. What would happen if she needed money for something important? Michael insisted the money was safe with them, but Joan knew all too well that once it was handed over, asking for money from them would be humiliating. Finally, Michael asked her to sell her house in the countryside. The home that Tom had worked so hard to provide for them was now being called into question. Michael said that whether she sold it now or later, the house would eventually belong to him. He argued that selling it now would help buy a home for their children, especially for the grandchildren, who might need a place near their school. Joan was heartbroken. The house wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was her sanctuary, her final refuge. It was where she had hoped to spend her last years. She couldn't bear the thought of selling it, not for anyone. Joan reflected deeply on the conditions. The first two were tolerable, she could adapt to them, but the third and fourth struck at the core of her independence. Her late husband had saved that money for her to have a sense of security in her old age, and the house was their legacy. Giving it up, especially under such coercion, felt like losing her last shred of dignity. She knew the real issue was deeper than the money. It was the lack of respect. Michael believed she was being selfish, hoarding money, and not wanting to contribute to the family. He compared her to the parents of his colleagues, who had given everything to their children without hesitation. But Joan knew that was not the point. She had spent her life giving to her family, ensuring they had everything they needed, but now it felt like nothing was enough. She wasn't asking for much, only the right to live her final years in peace. "I cannot accept this," Joan finally said, her voice trembling with a mix of sadness and resolve. "It's not that I am greedy or don't want to help, but that house is our home. Without it, where would we go in our old age when we can no longer take care of ourselves? I still want to go back to the countryside and live my final days there. And as for the house for the grandchildren, he's only 9 years old. Why rush? It can wait." Joan's heart broke as she realized the full extent of her son's lack of understanding. The house where they lived was bought with the money she and Tom had set aside for their retirement. There was a room in that house that belonged to her. Yet Michael demanded that she give everything away. The final blow came when Michael accused her of hiding her money and not wanting to contribute. Joan felt betrayed. She had given so much to him over the years, and now he was calling her selfish. In her mind, it wasn't about the money. It was about respect, the respect that she had always shown to him, and the trust that she had once placed in him. Joan knew that staying with Michael and Amanda under these conditions was not an option. She refused to live out her last years under such pressure. Instead, Joan decided to take control of her destiny. She sold the house, used the proceeds to secure her future, and moved into a high-end nursing home where she could live independently, free from judgment and control. Her children were furious when they learned of her decision, demanding that the compensation money be divided among them. But Joan had made her choice. She had given them everything she could, and now it was her time to live for herself. As Joan sat in her new home, surrounded by people who respected her, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Her children, now regretful, visited her in shifts, offering apologies and asking for her forgiveness. But Joan, with a calm resolve, simply said, "In the past, you treated me as if I didn't matter. Now, I will do the same. I have lived for you long enough." Her children called her selfish, indifferent, and cold, but Joan knew that she had done what was necessary. She had lived a life of selflessness, but now, it was time for her to live with dignity. And that was something no one could take away from her. "My name is Din, and I am an elderly woman who has lived alone since my husband passed away. People often assume that because I receive a pension of 15 million VND a month, I should be living comfortably, but the reality is far from it. Despite having a steady income, I lead a miserable life, and the source of my misery is my children. In the past, I had poured my heart and soul into raising them. I thought that if I gave everything to my children when I grew old, they would take care of me in return. Every time they needed something, whether it was school fees, a new car, or help with starting a family, I provided. I believed that my sacrifices would be repaid in my later years, and that my children would be there to look after me as I had looked after them. But as time went on, I started to feel a growing unease, a nagging voice telling me that I was not as secure as I thought I was. It came from a simple conversation I had with a friend, who had been through similar struggles in her old age. She advised me, bluntly, "Don't rely on your children when you're old. Start saving money for yourself now." At first, I dismissed it. How could I turn my back on my children? They had always been so kind to me, and I had spent my entire life helping them. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that she was right. The truth is my children, despite their promises and good intentions, would likely not be there for me when I needed them most. I started to calculate. If I kept using my money to help my children, what would I have left for myself when I became frail and needed care? Would they still be willing to take care of me when I no longer had anything to offer them? Would I become a burden, a nuisance they would gladly cast aside when I could no longer care for myself? This realization hit me hard, and I knew what I had to do. From then on, I began saving my pension money. I still remember my husband's advice to me: save for your old age. Don't give everything to them. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about self-preservation, about ensuring I would never find myself in a position where I had to rely on others for care or financial support. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment below to let me know that you are still here with me. As the years passed, my children grew older, married, and started their own families. One day, they came to me with a request. Each of them needed 200 million VND to support their own families. I had 600 million VND saved up by then, and I could have easily given them the money. After all, they were my children. But something inside me stopped me. This money wasn't just for them, it was for me. It was my safety net, the only thing that would ensure I could live my old age without worrying about where my next meal would come from, or who would take care of me if I became sick. I told them firmly, "This money is for my old age. I will not give it to you. You are adults now, and you should be able to manage your own life. If you continue to rely on me, you will become like children who expect to eat without working." They were furious. They argued with me, saying that they had no other choice but to ask me for help. They promised that if I helped them now, they would take care of me later. But something inside me clicked. I realized that my children weren't asking for money out of genuine need. They were hoping I would continue to be their financial backer, a safety net they could rely on whenever they needed something. They weren't thinking about me. They were thinking about what I could provide for them. And I could no longer allow myself to be used in this way. At that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. I had worked hard all my life, and I had learned that money should not be used as a means of exchange for love or care. I had spent too many years living for others, and now it was time for me to live for myself. I decided that from now on, I would no longer help my children financially. My money was for my old age, and if they wanted anything, they would have to find a way to get it themselves. I would no longer be their bank or their source of security. I had learned the hard way that relying on children, no matter how filial they seem, is a risky gamble. Now, I live alone, but I do not feel lonely. I have installed security cameras and an alarm system in my house, so if anything happens, my children and grandchildren will be alerted. I have even made arrangements to hire a caregiver when I can no longer manage on my own. I will not burden my children with my care. I will hire professionals to ensure I am well taken care of when the time comes. Looking back, I feel a deep sense of relief. I no longer have to worry about whether my children will be there for me. I have saved enough to take care of myself, and that gives me peace of mind. I know that in my later years, I won't have to beg my children for money or care. I will live my life on my terms, not theirs. Saving money for old age is not selfish. It is a wise and practical decision. Many elderly people in my situation have suffered because they didn't prepare for the future, relying instead on their children who, as I now understand, often have their own families and problems to deal with. When you are old, you must take care of yourself. You cannot rely on others, especially not on your children, who may one day disappoint you. As I sit here now, in my quiet home, I know I have made the right choice. I have worked hard for my savings, and I will use that money to ensure my old age is comfortable and dignified. My children may be disappointed with me, but I know they will eventually understand. And if they don't, that's okay. I have done what's best for me. The truth is, that parents should not have to rely on their children for care in their old age. We should prepare ourselves, financially and emotionally, to live out our years with independence and self-respect. Because, in the end, it is not the money we give to our children that defines our worth, but the love and wisdom we leave behind. My name is Din, and I never imagined that saving money for my old age would become the source of my greatest regret. When I was younger, I believed that the sacrifices I made for my children would be repaid when I grew old. After all, I had devoted my entire life to them, providing, nurturing, and doing everything in my power to ensure they had what they needed. I thought that in return, when the time came for me to grow frail, they would be there to take care of me. I had always been taught that it was my duty as a parent to prepare my children for the future, but as I grew older, I realized that the opposite was just as true. My children needed to prepare for the future themselves, and I needed to ensure I would have the means to take care of myself in my later years. Yet, despite the advice I received from friends and the warnings in my heart, I could never imagine the depth of the isolation that would come from this decision. For years, I lived comfortably knowing that my children had grown independent and that they no longer depended on me financially. But one by one, they drifted away. They married, settled into their own lives, and found success. I felt a deep sense of relief that they were no longer burdened by the expectations of their mother's financial help. However, it wasn't long before I found myself alone, my children living their lives without a second thought for me. Then, the unexpected happened. My husband, the person I thought would always be by my side, was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors gave him little hope, and I watched helplessly as the love of my life deteriorated before my eyes. I poured all my savings into his treatment, even selling our house to cover medical costs. But despite every effort, his condition only worsened, and soon I was left alone, widowed, and without the one person who had been my support throughout life. The pain of losing him was indescribable, and I fell ill myself. For half a month, I stayed in the hospital, and during that time, not a single one of my children came to visit me. They knew I was sick, but their hearts had grown distant. They blamed me for abandoning them in the past, for not helping them when they needed it most. They had their own families now, their own lives to live. To them, I had become a stranger. I hired a caregiver to take care of me after I was discharged, but the cost was high, and soon, I found myself draining the last of my savings. Despite all my efforts to save for old age, there was no escaping the reality of my situation. My modest pension couldn't cover my daily expenses, and I had no other means to get by. Every penny I had saved over the years, every sacrifice I made to ensure I would not burden my children in old age, was now gone. As I looked at the empty house and felt the loneliness creep in, I couldn't help but feel bitter. I had saved money for years, thinking it would protect me in my later years, but I had never imagined that this would be the price I would have to pay. Isolation, regret, and the painful realization that my children had long since stopped considering me their mother. The regret became unbearable when my health began to fail again. Each visit to the hospital cost me around 10 million VND, and I had nothing left to pay for it. Desperate, I reached out to my children, asking them for help, but their response was cold. They reminded me of the times I had refused to help them, of the times I had been stingy and refused to give them money when they needed it. Now, when I needed them the most, they felt no obligation to help me. I was devastated. "I'm still your mother," I said, my voice breaking. "How can you be so heartless?" My son's reply stung like a slap. "We're not heartless, Mom. You are. If you hadn't been so selfish, so focused on saving your money for yourself, we wouldn't have grown to resent you. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." And with that, the phone call ended. My heart shattered, and I was left alone, confronting the consequences of my own decisions. I had been wrong. I had been so focused on saving money for old age, thinking that it was the responsible thing to do, that I had neglected the emotional needs of my children. I had hoped they would one day care for me in return, but in doing so, I had failed to nurture the relationship with them when it mattered most. I had been too harsh and too focused on my security, and in the process, I had lost everything that truly mattered: my family. Looking back, I can see how my choices led me to this point. When my children were young, I should have supported them, but I should also have taught them the value of self-reliance. As they grew older, I should have been there for them, not just financially, but emotionally. And when they started their own families, I should have supported them in ways that weren't based on money. Helping them with grandchildren, supporting their careers, and nurturing our bond would have been far more valuable than the money I saved. Now, I see that saving for old age is not just about money. It's about love, family, and connection. Parents should not be so focused on saving money that they forget the emotional and relational needs of their children. Children, too, must learn to give back to their parents, not just when they are asked, but because it's their responsibility to care for the ones who care for them. But parents should never expect that care to be given only when it's convenient or when they have something to offer. In the end, I have learned the hard way that old age is not just about saving money. It's about making sure your children never feel like strangers, and about nurturing the relationships that will carry you through your later years. I can't undo what I've done, and I can't change the past. But I can share my story in hopes that others will learn from my mistakes. Saving money for old age is important, but it should never come at the expense of the love and support that make life worth living. The phone screen flickered to life, displaying a series of numbers, unfamiliar yet strangely familiar. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. It had been so many years since I'd heard from Min Jung, my son. Slowly, I pressed the button, the screen buzzing as his voice, warm and deep, echoed through the speaker. "Mom, is it you?" His voice trembled, as though he, too, feared this might be a dream. "I miss you. Let's have a meal together. The whole family." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. This was the first time he had called me. Truly called me, not because of a favor or obligation, but because he wanted to reconnect. The voice I heard was soft, gentle, and full of emotions I hadn't heard in years. This was not the cold, distant voice I remembered. It was different, almost tender. For a moment, joy and fear tangled in my chest. Could the distance between us, built over 25 years, really be erased so easily? Could this truly be the beginning of healing, or was it another fleeting moment that would slip through my fingers? Just as I was about to agree, a message lit up my phone. Bowen, my granddaughter. "Dear lady, don't agree. Please don't." The words caught me off guard. Bowen had always been a cautious child, and I knew that she cared for me deeply. She had told me once that Min Jung was in financial trouble and that he had been inquiring about our situation. I had always hoped that my son would reach out to help when the time came, but now that the moment had arrived, I wasn't sure what to expect. I smiled bitterly as memories flooded back. Coldness is not better than compensation money, I thought to myself as I read the message, shaking my head. I closed my eyes, and old memories slowly came rushing back, like a slow-motion film in my mind. My story began long before this phone call, in a small, peaceful mountain village where I was born in 1969. I was the youngest of the family, cherished and adored by my parents and siblings. Though life was difficult back then, with scarce resources and simple comforts, our home was always filled with love. I still remember how, during every Tet holiday, even though we could only afford to sew one new set of clothes, it was always mine to wear first. My siblings would always give me their share of treats, and when times were tough, they worked tirelessly to support my education. I excelled in school, always at the top of my class, eager to repay their sacrifices by doing my best. As I grew older, I entered vocational school, where I met Dai Dung, the man who would eventually become my husband. It was a sunny day in 1987 when I accidentally bumped into him outside the library. Books were scattered everywhere, and we both scrambled to pick them up. He smiled kindly as he handed them back, and that was the first moment I truly noticed him. Over time, we became close, and his gentle care for me, especially when I was ill, captured my heart. Despite the warnings from my parents, who feared the unstable nature of his family background, I was determined to marry him. My father, wise and cautious, worried about the influence of his father's abusive behavior. My mother, too, advised me to be careful. But at 20, in the heat of love, I couldn't see past my emotions. The tension in my family grew as I insisted on my choice. Arguments erupted, and my heart ached as I cried in my room, but I refused to back down. "I trust him, Mom. He's not like his father." "He's different," I told her, though deep down, I wasn't sure if I was fooling myself. After much deliberation, my parents reluctantly agreed to my marriage with Dai Dung in 1990. The wedding was modest, a simple celebration with family and friends. But in my heart, I felt I was stepping into a bright new chapter of my life, convinced that love would conquer all. Little did I know, it was just the beginning of a long, painful journey. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 5 below to let me know that you are still here with me. In the early years of our marriage, things were peaceful. We built a small home, worked together, and dreamed of a better future. But as time passed, cracks began to show. Dai Dung, once so gentle and caring, began to change. He grew increasingly short-tempered and irritable over small things. The man who had once cared for me when I was sick now shouted at me for trivial mistakes. I remember one evening, I was late preparing dinner. The rice wasn't done on time, and he exploded. "What are you doing? So useless. Even cooking properly, you can't do," he shouted, his face contorted with anger. I stood there, tears streaming down my face, stunned by the cruel words. The man I had fallen in love with, the one who had been so kind and considerate, was now someone I barely recognized. It wasn't just the anger that hurt, it was the change in him, the way he slowly became a stranger to me. But I stayed. I had made my choice, and I would endure, as I had always endured. I believed, foolishly, that love could heal all wounds. I didn't know then that love, no matter how deep, couldn't change someone who had already been hurt so much in their own life. But in those early years, we had built something together. We had a son, Min Jung, and a daughter, Bao En. I loved them with all my heart, hoping they would have better lives than we did. Yet, as they grew older, the distance between us widened. I focused on my children, pouring everything into them, believing they would take care of me when I was older. But as life went on, they grew distant. Min Jung left for the city, building his life, and Bao En too found her path. Now, years later, amid my pain, Min Jung called. After all this time, after all that had happened between us, he reached out. But why? Was it truly a moment of reconciliation, or just an attempt to ease his conscience? The phone call was filled with uncertainty, and even as I yearned to believe it was genuine, something in my heart told me that it might be too little, too late. I closed my eyes again as the weight of the past pressed down on me. Coldness is not better than compensation money. I had spent so many years focused on surviving, saving, and protecting myself, believing that if I prepared enough, everything would work out in the end. But now, I realized that no amount of money could replace the love of a family, and no amount of wealth could heal the wounds of neglect and regret. As I continued to pour my heart into caring for my grandson, the wounds of the past never truly healed. It was a bittersweet experience. On one hand, the joy of caring for this innocent life, but on the other, the suffocating weight of the years I had lost with my son. Every smile from my grandson was a fleeting reminder of the bond one had longed for with Min Jung. Yet, as I showered him with love, I couldn't help but feel the echoes of my son's absence in my own heart. The time spent at Min Jung's home, however, wasn't as peaceful as I had hoped. As much as I tried to bury the past, the emotional distance between us lingered. There were moments when I saw the coldness in my son's eyes, the shadow of resentment from years ago. He would speak to me with a distant politeness, but it was clear that the warmth we once shared was now a distant memory. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when my grandson was asleep, I would look at Min-jung and wonder, did he ever really forgive me? Does he understand why I did what I did? But no answers came. It felt like we were both trapped in a never-ending cycle of misunderstanding, where the years of silence had built invisible walls that neither of us knew how to break down. Despite my efforts, the wounds that had festered for so long were still there, silently pulling us apart. My love for my son was unconditional, but his indifference was an undeniable truth. I had always hoped that one day he would understand, that one day the painful misunderstandings would clear. But as each day passed, I began to realize that some things may never be fixed, no matter how much love we give. My life, it seemed, had been shaped by sacrifices that went unnoticed, by choices that had led me down paths I could not return from. I had sacrificed everything for my family, my happiness, my peace, my own needs. But now, in my old age, I found myself standing at the crossroads of regret and resilience, unsure of which way to go. One evening, as I sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I finally understood something that had eluded me for so many years. I had spent so much of my life trying to fix things that could not be fixed. I had believed that if I just tried hard enough, everything would fall into place. But the truth was that sometimes, no matter how much we love someone, we can't change them. We can't undo the damage that's been done. What I could change, however, was my own life. I could choose to let go of the past. I could stop chasing after a reconciliation that might never come and instead focus on the relationship I had with myself. It was a hard pill to swallow, realizing that some things were beyond my control. But in that quiet moment, I promised myself that I would stop living in the shadows of my past mistakes and start living for the person I am now. The truth was that I had given everything for my children. I had spent years sacrificing my own happiness, hoping that they would understand and appreciate it someday. But I had never learned how to love myself, and how to take care of my own emotional well-being. I had poured all my love into others, and in doing so, I had forgotten to nurture my soul. Perhaps this was the lesson I was meant to learn. To forgive me. To stop blaming myself for everything that had gone wrong. To stop feeling guilty for things that were beyond my control. And most importantly, to stop sacrificing myself in the hope of earning someone else's love or forgiveness. I looked at my grandson, peacefully sleeping in my arms, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had failed as a mother in many ways, but I was not going to fail as a grandmother. I was going to be there for him, but I would also learn to take care of myself. I would give him all the love I had, but I would no longer give away my peace, my happiness, or my sense of self. At that moment, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer wait for Min-jung to forgive me, or for him to come to terms with the past. I would no longer live my life with the weight of unspoken words and unresolved pain. Instead, I would live each day with the love I had for my grandson and the quiet strength that came from learning to love myself. Perhaps that was the only kind of reconciliation that could heal my heart. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in many years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not for the relationship I had lost, but for the future that lay ahead. One where I could finally choose my own happiness, free from the ghosts of the past. As the days passed after I left Min-jung's home, I often found myself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Despite all the pain, a part of me felt lighter. I had finally taken a step toward reclaiming some semblance of control over my life, but the relief was short-lived. The bitterness of my past was something that refused to fade quickly, and it lingered like a shadow over my every thought. The incident at the hospital had been the final straw. My children's words had stung more deeply than I expected. They had all but condemned me for my past actions, accusing me of being heartless, of being stingy with my love and care. And while I knew they had valid reasons for their anger, my heart ached knowing that the rift between us was so deep, so irreparable. At that moment, I realized that all the years I had spent saving, all the years I had poured into sacrificing for them, had ultimately led to this, a void between us that no amount of effort could fill. I couldn't help but reflect on the choices I had made over the years. I had always believed that by securing my financial stability, I could ensure that my children wouldn't have to bear the burden of caring for me in my old age. I wanted to protect them from hardship, to give them the freedom to build their own lives. But I had never truly understood that the greatest gift I could give them wasn't money or security. It was my presence, my emotional support, my ability to love them unconditionally, without the strings of expectation. The harsh reality was that by keeping my distance, by focusing so much on my financial independence, I had unintentionally pushed them away. I had failed to balance my role as a mother with the wisdom that comes from aging. I had wanted to spare them the responsibility of caring for me, but in doing so, I had isolated myself in my time of need. Now, when I finally needed help, I was met with coldness and rejection. And in that moment, I realized that the true cost of my independence was not just the physical distance between us, but the emotional distance I had created over the years. I couldn't undo what had been done, and the regret that settled in my heart was a heavy burden to carry. It was too late to change the past, but the lessons I learned from it were clear. I had been too proud, too focused on self-sufficiency, and too blind to the needs of my children. I had overlooked the importance of being emotionally present for them, of nurturing the bond that was meant to sustain us through the difficult years. Now, my children saw me as a stranger, and I was left to face the consequences of my choices. That night, after the phone call, I sat in silence, the weight of their words sinking in. I knew I had been wrong, but my regret was not enough to undo the damage. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. I had lived for so long thinking that financial stability was the key to a peaceful old age, but I had neglected to realize that without an emotional connection, understanding, and compassion, none of it mattered. As the days went on, I began to focus more on myself. I stopped calling my children and stopped waiting for them to reach out. I had given them everything I could, and now it was time to turn inward. I realized that while I couldn't change my relationship with them, I could change how I viewed myself. I could learn to accept my mistakes, to forgive myself for the things I had done wrong, and to stop holding on to the past with such a tight grip. But even as I began to find some semblance of peace, the sting of loneliness never fully left me. I missed my children, despite everything. I missed the sound of their voices, the warmth of their presence, even the disagreements that had once been so painful. It was a difficult truth to accept, but I knew that my life was no longer about fixing what had been broken. It was about learning to live with the pieces that were left. And so, I made a decision. I would no longer let the past control my future. I would not continue to harbor regret or bitterness. I would live for myself now, slowly, quietly, and with a sense of acceptance that came from understanding the limits of my power. I would focus on what I could control: my health, my happiness, and my sense of peace. I would stop trying to fix relationships that were beyond repair and instead pour my love into what still had the potential to grow, the small, simple joys of life. It wasn't easy, and I knew that my journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had begun to let go of the suffocating weight of regret. I was slowly learning to forgive myself and to accept that life, in all its complexity, couldn't be neatly packaged into a set of right or wrong choices. It was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes painful, but it was still mine to live. As the sun began to rise the next morning, I felt a small spark of hope for the future, knowing that even if my children and I never found our way back to one another, I could still create a life for myself that was filled with meaning, love, and purpose. The story of reclaiming the house for my son-in-law has been one of the most painful yet liberating experiences of my life. It wasn't just about the house. It was about standing up for myself, for my dignity, and for the respect that every person deserves, no matter their age or status in life. 4 years, I had silently endured, assuming that family bonds would always protect me. But what happened made me realize that love and respect in families cannot be taken for granted. My son-in-law, whom I had once treated as a son, had become someone I no longer recognized. When I needed support the most, he not only rejected me but tried to take away the one thing I had worked for and earned. It all began one day when I was in the middle of taking care of my granddaughter, a responsibility I had embraced fully. She was my lifeline, a reason to keep going, even when life felt unbearable. But when my son-in-law spoke those cold, callous words, telling me that caring for me in my old age was not his responsibility, I couldn't stay silent anymore. How could he? After all those years of sacrifice for his family, the betrayal felt like a sharp knife to my heart. Where is your conscience? I cried, remembering how, at 15, I had already been the pillar of support for the family. Yet now, the same people I had cared for had no remorse in denying me the care I deserved. My son-in-law looked at me, unmoved, and coldly responded, "This house is because you bought it. Caring for the elderly is our responsibility. Mother, do not interfere." I stood there, stunned. This house, my house, was now being contested by the very people I had given everything for. My son-in-law saw it as an asset to be controlled, to wield power over me. "What can you do?" he sneered, as if the bond we shared meant nothing. But that was the moment I knew. I had to fight for what was mine, not just to reclaim the house, but to preserve my sense of self-worth. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 6 below to let me know that you are still here with me. I didn't want to bring the matter to court, but the situation left me no choice. So, I called a lawyer and began the legal process. The lawyer reassured me that I had a strong case and that the house documentation was clear. My son-in-law had no legal right to the property. Despite the emotional toll this was taking, I pushed forward. For me, this wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting my dignity and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. I called my daughter, and with a heavy heart, I explained the situation. She was sorry, apologizing for not seeing how her husband had manipulated the situation. "I was too lenient," she admitted, but I reassured her. I didn't want her to bear guilt for his actions. "From now on, we will rely on each other," I said, feeling the weight of the years we had spent drifting apart. At the court hearing, the tension was palpable. I had to recount everything: the way my son-in-law had taken over the house, his cruel words, his attempts to control me. His lawyer argued that the house was purchased by him, claiming that I had no right to it. The judge, however, asked the key question: "Did you purchase this house alone?" My son-in-law stammered, and when asked about the house certificate, he faltered. His wife, my daughter, was not even mentioned as a co-purchaser. The judge declared that the house belonged to me. I had won. My son-in-law's family was ordered to vacate the property. The victory was bittersweet. My daughter cut off all contact with me after the ruling, blaming me for the rift between us. "You're too heartless," she said, but I understood. She was angry, confused, and hurt by the choices I had made. It wasn't easy, and my heart ached, but I stood firm. I could not accept the betrayal. I could not live under the roof of someone who had tried to destroy me, no matter how much I loved my daughter. In the aftermath of the legal battle, I found solace in moving forward with my life. I started participating in social activities, making new friends, and slowly rediscovering myself. I couldn't let bitterness consume me, even though the pain of losing my daughter was something I carried with me. But I had learned something vital in the process. True family affection cannot be measured by material possessions or the manipulation of others for profit. One day, I ran into my son-in-law by chance while walking in the park. His appearance shocked me. He was disheveled, his once confident demeanor replaced with a sense of defeat. He approached me, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. He tried to make excuses, accusing me of wronging him, but I was no longer moved by his words. The anger, the resentment, it had all faded into a quiet understanding that I had done what I needed to do to protect myself. I calmly replied, "This house is mine, and I will reclaim it. You dishonored me. You dishonored this family." He tried to argue, but I was resolute. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity. And though my relationship with my daughter and son-in-law was shattered, I knew I had done what was right for me. The road ahead was uncertain, but I had taken control of my future. Thank you for listening to this powerful story. We've witnessed the emotional journey of someone who gave everything for their family, only to face betrayal and neglect in return. From this experience, we've learned some important lessons about self-respect, setting boundaries, and understanding the complex dynamics of family relationships. So, what have you learned from this story? Is there a particular lesson that stood out to you? Maybe it's about standing up for your dignity, protecting your rights, or understanding the importance of balancing selflessness with self-care. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please take a moment to share one thing you've learned from this video and how you plan to bring it into practice in your own life. Leave your comment below and let's start a conversation. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content that explores real-life stories, personal growth, and meaningful life lessons. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.